I've always loved hunting. It's not just about the thrill of the chase or the satisfaction of a successful kill. It's about being out there, deep in the wilderness, where the world feels raw and untamed. There's a certain peace that comes with the connection to nature that's hard to find anywhere else. But there was one trip in the dead of winter that made me realize just how terrifying that solitude can be. It was mid-January, and I was hunting in the mountains far from any town or village. The weather had been harsh all week, frigid temperatures, biting winds, and snow that seemed to fall endlessly, covering the landscape in a thick white blanket. The forest was a silent, frozen world. I had been tracking a deer for hours, but the storm was growing worse, and I knew I had to find shelter soon. The sky was a dull gray, and the snow was falling so heavily that it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. The wind howled through the trees, driving the snow into my face and making it difficult to keep moving forward. Just as I was starting to worry that I might find shelter in time, I spotted a small cabin through the trees. It was tucked away in a clearing, almost hidden by the snow-covered pines. Relief washed over me. I knew I had to get out of the storm, and this cabin was my only chance. I trudged through the snow, my feet heavy and numb, until I reached the cabin. It was old, with weathered wooden walls and a slanted roof that was nearly buried under the snow. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, and I could see a faint light flickering through the window. Someone was inside. I knocked on the door, feeling a mix of relief and hesitation. The door creaked open, and I was greeted by a man who stood just inside, his figure obscured by the shadows. He was tall and thin, dressed in a heavy coat and a hat that cast his face in darkness. I couldn't make out his features, but there was something about his posture, the way he stood so still, that made me uneasy. "I'm caught in the storm," I said, my voice trembling slightly from the cold. "Can I take shelter here for the night?" The man nodded slowly, without saying a word, and stepped back to let me in. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside, grateful to be out of the biting wind. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, a single room with a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a fireplace that provided the only light. A pot of something was simmering over the fire, filling the room with a faint, savory scent. I removed my coat and boots, feeling the warmth begin to seep back into my frozen limbs. The man motioned for me to sit at the table, and I did, the chair creaking under my weight. He moved to the fireplace, stirring the pot, but he never spoke. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. I tried to make conversation to break the awkwardness. "I've been hunting out here for days," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the small space. "The storm caught me off guard. I'm lucky I found your cabin." The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, stirring the pot with slow, deliberate movements. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he avoided looking directly at me, or the way his shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the floor. As I sat there, trying to warm myself by the fire, I noticed something else. Every time I glanced away, it seemed like the man had moved closer, even though I hadn't heard him take a step. When I looked back, he was always in the same spot, standing by the fire, but each time he seemed just a little nearer. The tension in the room was palpable. I could feel my heart beating faster, a growing sense of unease creeping up my spine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired after being out in the storm for so long. But then I saw a flicker of movement in the shadows, just out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the man, still standing by the fire. I was on edge now, every instinct telling me that something was very wrong. Desperate to break the silence, I asked if I could have some of whatever was in the pot. The man paused, his hand hovering over the ladle, and for a moment I thought he might actually speak. But then he simply nodded and ladled some of the stew into a bowl, setting it on the table in front of me. I took a bite, but the food tasted bland, almost metallic, and I found I had no appetite. The man watched me closely, his eyes glinting in the firelight, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I pushed the bowl away, suddenly not hungry at all. "I think I'll turn in for the night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded again, his face still hidden in the shadows, and I stood up, my legs trembling as I made my way to the far corner of the room where there was a small cot. I lay down, pulling the thin blanket over me, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind outside had picked up, howling louder than ever, and the cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of the storm. I kept my eyes closed, trying to ignore the sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would hear a soft creak, like someone was moving slowly across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had to resist the urge to look. I told myself it was just the wind, just the old cabin settling, but deep down, I knew better. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes just a crack and peered across the room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim, reddish glow. The man was still there, standing by the fireplace, but he was closer now, much closer. He was watching me. I closed my eyes again, my mind racing. I was trapped in this cabin, miles from anyone, with a man who seemed to be something other than human. The fear was overwhelming, a cold, paralyzing terror that made it hard to breathe. I had to get out, I had to leave, storm or no storm. But how could I do it without him noticing? I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just lay there, listening to the wind howling outside and the soft creaks of the floorboards as the man shifted his weight. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard him move away from the fireplace. I cracked my eyes open again and saw that he had turned his back to me, staring into the dying embers. This was my chance. I slowly, silently pushed the blanket off and slipped out of the cot. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I moved toward the door, each step agonizingly slow, praying the floor wouldn't creak under my weight. When I reached the door, I hesitated for just a moment, then grabbed my coat and boots and flung the door open. The wind hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I ran out into the storm, the snow stinging my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I just ran as fast as I could through the snow and the wind until I could no longer see the cabin behind me. My legs were burning, my lungs aching, but I didn't stop until I spotted another cabin in the distance, its lights a beacon in the storm. I stumbled to the door and pounded on it, desperate for help. This time, the door was opened by a woman, her face filled with concern as she saw the state I was in. She quickly ushered me inside, where a fire was blazing, filling the room with warmth and light. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words were jumbled, incoherent. All I could say was that I had been at another cabin, that something was wrong there. The woman's face grew pale as she listened, and she exchanged a worried glance with the man sitting by the fire. "There hasn't been anyone at that cabin for years," the man said quietly. "The owner was murdered there, and no one's lived there since." A cold chill ran down my spine. I wanted to argue, to insist that I had been there, that someone was there, but I knew it was pointless. The truth was staring me in the face, and it was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. Home is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where familiarity breeds comfort, not fear. But what happens when that familiarity is twisted, when something you've always trusted suddenly becomes terrifying? That's what I experienced one night, and it's a memory that still haunts me to this day. It was a typical Friday evening, and I was home alone, catching up on homework at the kitchen table. My mom had gone out to run some errands, leaving me to fend for myself until she got back. The house was unnervingly quiet, only the faint hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. The sun had already set, leaving the kitchen's warm light to cast eerie, elongated shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside, everything felt cozy and safe. I had music playing softly in the background, a playlist of my favorite songs, and I was lost in the rhythm of solving math problems and jotting down notes. I was halfway through an algebra problem when I heard it, a voice calling my name from the basement. It was my mom's voice, clear as day, calling out in that familiar tone she always used when she wanted me to come help with something. "Emma, can you come down here for a second?" I paused, my pencil hovering over the paper. For a moment, I thought I must have imagined it. My mom wasn't supposed to be home yet, and besides, why would she be in the basement? But then I heard it again, exactly the same as before. "Emma, can you come down here for a second?" The voice was unmistakable, but something about it felt off. Too flat, too monotone, like a recording being played back on a loop. I felt a strange unease settle in my stomach, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe she had come home early and I just hadn't noticed. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and made my way to the basement door. The door was slightly ajar, and the light from the kitchen spilled into the darkness beyond. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob before slowly pulling it open. The basement stairs creaked as I descended, each step taking me deeper into the shadows. The air grew cooler, and the familiar smell of concrete and old boxes filled my nose. The basement was always a little eerie at night, but I had never been afraid of it before. It was just a part of the house, a place where we stored holiday decorations and old furniture. But tonight, it felt different. The shadows seemed to stretch farther, the darkness heavier, as if the basement had expanded into something vast and unknown. I reached the bottom of the stairs and flicked on the light, the fluorescent bulbs flickering to life with a dull hum. "Mom?" I called out, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Are you down here?" There was no answer, just the soft buzzing of the lights and the faint sound of the furnace kicking on. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the basement for any sign of her. The shelves were lined with boxes, and the old sofa sat in the corner, but there was no movement, no indication that anyone else was down here. I frowned, confusion mixing with a growing sense of dread. Had I imagined the voice? But it had been so clear, so real. I was sure I had heard her calling me. I took another step forward, peering around the shelves, but the basement was empty. "Mom?" I called again, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you here?" Nothing, just silence. I turned to head back upstairs, my heart pounding a little harder now when I heard it again. "Emma, come down here, please." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. The basement was as empty as it had been a moment ago. The voice had been so close, though, right next to me, as if someone had whispered it directly into my ear. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Was someone playing a trick on me? Was it some kind of prank? But the fear in my gut told me that it was something much worse. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and slammed the basement door behind me, my heart racing. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my mind reeling with what had just happened. The voice, it wasn't just in my head. I had heard it clear as day, but there was no one down there. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number. She picked up after a few rings, her voice cheerful and normal, which only made the situation more surreal. "Hey, Emma, what's up?" "Mom," I stammered, my voice shaking. "Are you home? Were you just in the basement?" There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of a grocery cart in the background. "No, honey, I'm still at the store." "Why? Is something wrong?" My blood ran cold. I thought I heard you calling me from the basement." Another pause, this one longer, and when my mom spoke again, her voice was laced with concern. "Emma, I'm not home. I'll be back in about 20 minutes. Are you okay?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, I'm fine. I thought I heard something." She tried to reassure me, but I could tell she was worried. We hung up, and I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the basement door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that maybe the stress of schoolwork and being alone had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I turned the TV on, trying to drown out the lingering fear with noise, but the house felt different now. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind rattling the windows set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing at the basement door, half expecting it to swing open on its own, for that voice to call out again. But the minutes ticked by and nothing happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of my mom's car pulling into the driveway. She came inside, bags of groceries in her arms, and the tension in my chest eased just a little. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the memory of that voice still fresh in my mind. I wanted to tell her everything, but I knew how it would sound, like a silly, paranoid fantasy. So I just helped her put away the groceries, trying to act normal, even though I felt anything but. We sat down to dinner, and I forced myself to eat even though I wasn't hungry. My mom chatted about her day, filling the silence with mundane details, but my mind kept drifting back to the basement, to the voice that had called me down there. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I looked up at her, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, and blurted out, "Mom, I'm scared." She set down her glass, her expression softening. "Scared of what, sweetheart?" I hesitated, then told her everything. About the voice, how I was sure it was her, how it had sounded so close, but there was no one there. I expected her to laugh it off, to tell me it was just my imagination, but instead she frowned, her face growing pale. "Emma," she said slowly, "you did the right thing by not going back down there." Her words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "Why? What do you mean?" She shook her head as if trying to find the right words. "Sometimes there are things that we can't explain, things that aren't supposed to be there. It's possible that what you heard wasn't me." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she was saying, but it sounded just like you. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I know, sweetheart. But that's what makes it so dangerous. Whatever it was trying to get you to go down there, and I don't think it had good intentions." We finished dinner in silence, the mood in the house now somber and heavy. My mom insisted that we both stay out of the basement for the rest of the night, and I didn't argue. She locked the basement door and double-checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. I went to bed that night with a knot of fear in my stomach, unable to shake the feeling that something was still down there, waiting for another chance to call me down. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, an uneasy silence that made it impossible to relax. The voice never came back, and we never spoke of that night again. But even now, years later, I can still hear it in my mind, calling out to me in that perfect imitation of my mother's voice, luring me into the dark, cold basement. And I still wonder, what would have happened if I had gone back down there? When I shared this story with a friend years later, she told me about something similar that had happened to her cousin. A voice calling them into the woods behind their house, mimicking their father. They never found out what it was either. Sometimes the familiar can be the most terrifying thing of all. When the people and places we trust are twisted into something malevolent, it shakes us to our core. And even though I've moved on from that house, that voice still lingers in the back of my mind. The fear of the familiar becoming something strange, something dangerous, is universal. It's the fear that what you know and trust can betray you in the most horrifying way. The voice in the basement, the voice that wasn't my mother, is a mystery I'll never solve. And maybe that's for the best. I've always been skeptical about the supernatural. Sure, I'd heard stories from friends and seen plenty of horror movies, but I never believed in any of it. Ghosts, demons, things that go bump in the night, they were all just tales to me, designed to scare those who were more easily frightened. But after what I experienced one summer night, I'm not so sure anymore. It was late July, and the nights were warm and sticky. I lived in a quiet suburb, the kind where nothing much happens, and that night was no different. I was out for a late night walk, something I often did to clear my head before bed. The streets were empty, the only sounds the occasional chirp of crickets. The moon was full, casting a soft silver light over everything, and the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass. It was the kind of night where everything felt peaceful, almost dreamlike, as if the world was holding its breath. As I walked, I took a detour through the small park near my house. It was just a patch of green with a few trees, a swing set, and a couple of benches, but it was always quiet, a good place to sit and think. I made my way down the path, my footsteps muffled by the grass, and found my usual spot on a bench under an old oak tree. I sat there for a while, lost in thought, watching the moonlight filter through the leaves. The park was empty, as it usually was at that hour, and I was enjoying the solitude when I heard it. A rustling sound, like something moving through the bushes just a few feet away. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a stray cat or a raccoon, something small and harmless. But then the rustling grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was in the bushes was getting closer. I sat up a little straighter, scanning the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal looking for food, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The rustling stopped for a moment, and the silence that followed was heavy, almost oppressive. I strained to listen, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure crouched low in the bushes, half hidden by the leaves. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of something hunched over, something that didn't quite look human. A jolt of fear shot through me, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon, or my mind playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath and decided to ignore it. If I didn't acknowledge it, it wouldn't be real. But as I stood up to leave, the figure moved. It shifted slightly, as if adjusting its position, and that's when I heard it. The sound of heavy, labored breathing, coming from right where the figure was hiding. Panic welled up inside me, and I quickly turned away, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I walked briskly out of the park, my footsteps quickening with each step, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that I was just tired, that I hadn't seen anything at all. By the time I got home, I had almost convinced myself that it was just my imagination. I locked the door behind me and went about my usual routine, brushing my teeth, washing my face, and changing into my pajamas. I was doing my best to forget about the strange encounter and go to bed. But as I lay there in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The room felt too quiet, too still, and every little noise, like the rustle of the curtains in the breeze, seemed amplified, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to fall asleep, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure in the park, the way it had moved, the sound of its breathing. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. What if it had followed me home? What if it was out there right now, watching me from the shadows? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was ridiculous. I hadn't seen anything, and even if I had, it was just an animal. There was no reason to be afraid. But despite my attempts to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I don't know how long I lay there, tossing and turning, but eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep. And that's when the real nightmare began. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body frozen in place, unable to move. I was lying on my back, staring up at the ceiling, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't lift my arms or turn my head. It was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body. Panic surged through me, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could only lie there, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I had experienced sleep paralysis before, but never like this, never with such an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, I saw it. At the foot of my bed, standing in the darkness, was the same figure I had seen in the park. It was taller now, towering over me, its hunched form grotesque and misshapen. Its skin was pale and sickly, like something long dead, and its eyes, those eyes were black pits, empty and soulless. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that filled the room. It was the same breathing I had heard before, heavy and labored, like the sound of something struggling to stay alive. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, helpless, as the figure loomed over me, its gaze locked on mine. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay, and I knew, deep in my gut, that this thing, whatever it was, meant to do me harm. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel the bed shift under its weight. The darkness seemed to close in around me, suffocating, as the figure leaned down, its face inches from mine. And then, in a voice that sounded like a chorus of whispers, it spoke my name. Daniel. The sound of my name coming from that thing's mouth sent a jolt of terror through me like nothing I had ever felt before. It was as if it was claiming me, marking me as its own. I could feel its breath on my face, cold and rancid, and I knew that if it touched me, if it so much as laid a finger on me, I would be lost. The world outside seemed so far away, distant and unreachable. I was completely alone, trapped in the darkness with this thing. this demon that had somehow followed me home. The clock on the nightstand ticked away the seconds, each one stretching into an eternity as the figure leaned in closer. I couldn't take it anymore. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced my body to move. I broke free of the paralysis with a violent jerk, my body lurching forward as I gasped for air. The figure was gone, the room was empty, and I was alone, drenched in sweat and shaking with fear. I lay there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing heart to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare. But it was too real, too vivid. The smell of decay still lingered in the air, and I could still feel the cold where the figure had stood. I never went back to that park. I never took another late-night walk. But even now, I can still see that figure in my mind, still hear the sound of its breathing and the way it whispered my name. I've tried to rationalize it, to explain it away as a vivid dream or a trick of the mind brought on by sleep paralysis. But deep down, I know that something followed me that night. Something dark and malevolent, something that should never have been there in the first place. There are things out there, things we can't see, can't explain, but they're real. And sometimes they come for us, out of the darkness, when we least expect it. The line between dream and reality is a fragile one, easily blurred, especially in the dead of night. Sleep paralysis is a terrifying phenomenon on its own, but when something else, something dark, enters that vulnerable space, it becomes something else entirely, a nightmare you can't wake up from. And as much as I try to forget that night, as much as I tell myself it was just a nightmare, I know that I'll never truly be free of it. Because once you've seen something like that, once it's called your name, it never really lets you go. Living alone is something that I enjoy a lot. The freedom to do what you want, when you want, and the comfort of having a space that's entirely your own. But that can also be a double-edged sword, especially when the night draws in and the dark corners of your home seem to hold more than just shadows. I had been living in my small farmhouse for about 6 months when it happened. It was a modest place, surrounded by green fields that stretched out as far as the eye could see, with only the occasional cluster of trees breaking up the horizon. I loved the isolation, the way the house stood alone against the vast landscape. It felt like a retreat, a place where I could truly be myself. The days were peaceful, filled with the simple routines of rural life: cooking, tending to the garden, reading by the fireplace. The nights, however, were a different story. The wind would pick up, whispering through the fields, and the darkness outside the windows would press in, thick and impenetrable. It was on one of those nights, a particularly cold and windy one, that the first sign of trouble appeared. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea before bed, when I first noticed it. The window over the sink faced the backyard, where the garden was. I often looked out at the view as I went about my evening routine. But that night, something was different. As I poured the hot water into my mug, I glanced up and froze. There in the window was a face. At first, I thought it was just a reflection. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but the face was still there, staring back at me. It was pale, expressionless, with eyes that seemed too large for its head and a mouth that was a thin, straight line. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a shadow, or some smudge on the glass that just happened to look like a face. I leaned in closer, squinting at the window, but the face remained, unmoving, unblinking. My heart began to race, and I took a step back, my mind scrambling to find a rational explanation. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that this was no illusion. There was someone, something, outside, watching me. I quickly turned off the kitchen light, plunging the room into darkness. Maybe if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. I stood there in the dark, my breath coming in short, waiting for the face to disappear. But when I dared to look again, it was still there, its eyes locked onto mine. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and dialed my neighbor John, who lived a mile down the road. He was the only person nearby who could help, the only one who might believe me. "John," I whispered frantically into the phone, "there's someone outside my house. I can see them through the kitchen window. Please, can you come over?" John, ever the calm and reassuring presence, told me he'd be right over. He tried to soothe me, to tell me that it was probably just a prank or some stray animal, but I could hear the concern in his voice. He promised he'd be there in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It felt like an eternity. I paced the kitchen, my eyes darting to the window every few seconds. The face never moved, never changed expression, like just stared back at me with those empty, soulless eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was studying me, trying to figure out how to get inside. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the living room and grabbed a blanket, draping it over the kitchen window to block out the sight. The room felt safer without that face staring in, but I still couldn't calm the pounding in my chest. I sat in the living room, every creak of the house making me jump. I kept glancing at the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster, praying for John to arrive. When I finally heard the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway, I practically ran to the front door, throwing it open before he could even knock. He stepped inside, a look of concern etched on his face, and I quickly locked the door behind him. "Where did you see it?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I pointed to the kitchen, and we both moved cautiously toward the window, the blanket still hanging over it. John slowly pulled it aside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness outside. For a moment, neither of us said anything, our eyes scanning the backyard. The face was gone. My heart sank, a mix of relief and dread washing over me. Had I imagined it? Was it all just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the isolation and the eerie night? John did a thorough check of the property, walking the perimeter of the house, shining his flashlight into every corner. But there was nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no signs of anyone having been there at all. He tried to reassure me, telling me it was probably just a shadow or a trick of the light, but his voice lacked conviction, and I could see the unease in his eyes. He offered to stay the night, to make sure I felt safe, but I insisted I'd be fine. I didn't want to admit how scared I really was. John left a few hours later, promising to check in the next morning. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking them twice before finally heading to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face again, staring at me through the glass. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed a window, I half expected to see that face staring back at me. But the day was bright and sunny, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I started to convince myself that maybe John was right. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, it happened again. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom. The window above the sink cracked open to let in some fresh air. As I leaned down to spit out the toothpaste, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, something pale and still, hovering just outside the window. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there, just the darkness beyond the glass. But I knew I had seen something. I knew it was back. I quickly shut the window, pulling the curtains closed with shaking hands. The house felt too big, too empty, and I was acutely aware of just how isolated I was. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the fields around my house stretched on for miles. If something was out there, if it wanted to get in, who would stop it? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, the lights on, clutching a blanket around my shoulders as I listened to the sounds of the night. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting that face to appear again. But it didn't, not that night at least. Over the next few days, I tried to carry on as usual, but the fear lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the face would return. I stopped looking out the windows at night, too afraid of what I might see. And then, one evening, as I was settling down with a book, I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. My blood ran cold, and I sat frozen, the book slipping from my hands as the tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent. I didn't move, didn't dare breathe, as the tapping grew louder. I knew what it was. I knew that if I looked, I would see that face staring back at me, those empty eyes watching me from the darkness. But I couldn't look. I couldn't bring myself to face it again. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed in on me from all sides. The next morning, I called John and told him everything. He listened, his voice calm but serious, and promised to come over that night to keep watch. He didn't say it, but I could tell he was worried too. When he arrived, we sat in the living room, the curtains drawn, and waited. The hours passed in tense silence, neither of us saying much, both of us listening for the slightest sound. But the night was quiet, the tapping didn't return, and by the time dawn broke, we were both exhausted but relieved. "I think it's over," John said, but there was doubt in his voice, a doubt that mirrored my own. The face in the window never appeared again, but the memory of it has stayed with me. The house no longer feels like before, and I've considered moving more than once. But something keeps me here, a stubbornness or maybe a need to confront whatever it was that visited me those nights. I still don't know what it was or why it chose to watch me. I don't know if it was a person, a ghost, or something else entirely. But I do know that I'll never forget that face and the way it made me feel helpless, terrified, and utterly alone. Some nights, I still wake up in the middle of the night expecting to hear that tapping, to see those eyes staring at me through the glass. And though it hasn't happened again, the fear lingers. A reminder that sometimes the scariest thing of all is knowing that you're not alone in the dark. If these stories sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and share the fear with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. Got a creepy story of your own? Drop it in the comments. I might just feature it in a future video. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are closer than you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.